Good morning, everyone. I'm April Palmerley, the CEO of AmCham Australia, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the AmCham Live from America U.S. Election Review webinar. Just a little Zoom housekeeping tip for all of you before we begin. Please be sure to type your questions in the Q&A box, not the chat section. Use the Q&A box if you have any questions throughout today's session, and the speakers will be happy to answer you. The webinar is being recorded and will be available on the AmCham members website. This is the latest in a series of election-related events that AmCham has been able to bring you this year. You might remember that on Election Day, we hosted a webinar with former foreign ministers Alexander Downer and Bob Carr, alongside CNN anchor Michael Holmes and Emmy Award-winning journalist Sarah James, with guest commentary from John Ruddick. That day, we also hosted a luncheon for 250 people in Adelaide, featuring the Honourable Stephen Patterson, Minister for Trade and Investment, the Honourable Christopher Pyne, the Honourable Jamie Briggs, Serafina Majorano, Dr. Pamela Ryan, and South Australian Chief Entrepreneur Jim Wally. Next year, in 2021, we will be hosting events around the inauguration and then again around the first 100 days. So please stay with us for lots and lots of election events. But today, you're all here to hear a terrific lineup of speakers on where we stand now in terms of the US election results that happened 2 weeks ago. I'd like to acknowledge the following AmCham governors who've joined the call today. We have Nick Varagos from Oppius International, Philip Campbell from Enigma Fit, and also Trudy Whitbrook from DFAT. Now let me introduce you to today's speakers. The Honourable Joe Hockey is founding partner and president of Bondi Partners, an advisory firm that offers strategic direction in the United States and Australia. He was previously elected Treasurer of Australia and then served as Australia's ambassador to the United States of America, taking up his posting in Washington in January 2016. Notably, Mr. Hockey was responsible for Australia's relationship with the US during the final year of the Obama administration and the first 3 years of President Trump's first term. I think that as ambassador, Mr. Hockey was best known for the emphasis he put on free and fair trade and the investment partnership between the US and Australia. He also did a great deal in promoting innovative infrastructure investment across the United States. We're very honored to have you here today, Your Excellency. We also have Miranda Devine, an opinion columnist for the New York Post and Sydney's Daily Telegraph. She appears on Fox News and Australia's Sky News. Previously, she worked at the Sydney Morning Herald, the Boston Herald, and the CSIRO. She is a dual citizen, like me, of the United States and Australia. Really honored that you can join us live from America today, Miranda Devine. Thank you. We also have Stephen Loosley AM. Former Senator Stephen Loosley AM served in the Australian Parliament during the Hawke and Keating governments, where he chaired both the Joint Committee on Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade and the Senate Regulations Committee. Prior to his Senate service, Stephen was the General Secretary of the New South Wales branch of the Australian Labor Party. He also served a term as the ALP National President. He is now Deputy Chair of TALIS, Australia, where he chairs the Security Committee, which has responsibility for the integrity of the company's cyber systems. He's a well-known commentator on US politics and writes for the Australian Financial Review, and the Spectator Australia, and is the book and film editor for The Strategist Canberra. On Australia Day 2015, Stephen was awarded an AM for services to the Parliament and to public policy. Very good to have you with us here today, sir. And moderating this stellar panel is Donald Betts Jr. Donald is a lawyer at global law firm Norton Rose Fulbright in Melbourne. He's also a former US-Kansas state senator, the youngest in the state's history when elected, and US congressional candidate. Donald is a commentator on Australian news media outlets on US politics and current events, and co-host of Greenland, the podcast, where the differences and similarities between the United States and Australia are explored. Thank you all so much for joining us today, and I'll turn it over to our moderator, Donald Betts now.
Thank you, April, for the kind introduction and for the ability to moderate this discussion on the US election results and review. I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands and waters in which we all meet today. I would like to acknowledge the tribal groups and clans from the Kulin Nation, the traditional custodians of the land I am presently on in Melbourne. I would like to pay respect to the elders of these lands and waters, both past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples joining in here today. I am part of the Reconciliation Action Plan Working Group at my law firm, Norton Fulbright, and I also work closely with Indigenous law firm Jeremy Legal. Last week, the NAIDOC week, we recognized the NAIDOC 2020 theme of Always Was, Always Will Be. I was privileged to learn that First Nations people have occupied and cared for this continent for over 65,000 years. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were Australia's first explorers, first navigators, first engineers, first farmers, first botanists, first scientists, first diplomats, first astronomers, and first artists. Australia has the world's oldest oral stories. This is something I acknowledge and I celebrate, and I thank First Nations people in Australia for managing, sustaining, and living in harmony with the lands and waters on this continent, now called Australia, and the lands and waters I now call home. We all knew this was going to be a spectacle of an election, for lack of a better word. The celebrity of Donald Trump versus the symbolic nomination of a female vice president who identifies as African American and South Asian. But I thought we could put this in context, starting off with opening statements from our panelists. Where are we now with this election? I'd like to start by the Honorable Senator Loosley. Senator Loosley is an expert on American politics. What are your thoughts on how historical this election is and the impact on what seems like a very divided nation?
Donald, I think to place matters in perspective, the United States, since the inception of the Republic, has been characterized by a recurring bitter contests over the presidency, beginning in 1800, where Thomas Jefferson's running mate, Colonel Aaron Burr, in a disputed ballot, tries to steal the election in the House of Representatives. 1824, Andrew Jackson is denied the presidency despite having won a plurality of votes, and of course the corrupt bargain of 1876, where the Democrats and Republicans divide power in Washington DC between White House and the Congress, but have the Union Army withdrawn from 3 southern states and bringing Reconstruction to an end. So you had that through the 19th century and into the 20th century. 1960, massive vote stealing by the Democrats in Texas and Illinois, Bush v. Gore in 2000. So this is a recurring pattern, but we've not seen anything of the scale of the challenge to American institutions that we've seen over recent weeks. Now, Donald Trump began constructing this narrative about the election being rigged. He needs the narrative of we was robbed. This goes back to 2016 in the contest with Hillary Clinton. And certainly early in 2020, the president began saying the only way he could be beaten was if the election was rigged. Now, there are always irregularities in any democratic ballot, but I doubt that we're going to see evidence of such intervention, such criminal intervention, that will overturn the result. To my mind, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris won the election, and they will be sworn in on 20 January. And my reference here is none other than Karl Rove, who wrote in the Wall Street Journal, I thought quite eloquently, that if you wanted to steal an American presidential election, you needed a conspiracy of James Bond proportions. And this hasn't happened, and it won't happen. So it is an extraordinary time we're passing through. There are real challenges here. And the American electorate, like the American people, are seriously polarized and divided. But this is not unusual if you look at the history of the Republic and how hotly certain presidential contests have become during the ballot and afterwards.
Thank you, Senator. Ms. Devine, can you give us some perspective? You're on the ground in the midst of COVID, financial crisis, all types of things are going on, and you're reporting on not just the presidential election, but all down ballot elections, federal and state. What will a Biden presidency look like when legislatures all over the country are likely as partisan as we've ever seen?
Thanks, Donald. Look, I agree with what you're saying about the division and the fact that Joe Biden may have won. I mean, I agree with Senator Loosley that, in fact, it's unlikely that Donald Trump is going to find enough votes to overturn the election. But, you know, I wouldn't rule out anything. I mean, there are all sorts of other ways. The Constitution, the American Constitution, is very robust and has a number of levers that can be pulled one way or the other. So let's see what happens. I'm sure Donald Trump has lots of tricks up his sleeve, and he told my colleague just a couple of days ago, Michael Goodwin, that I would never bet against Donald Trump. And a lot of people a lot of lawyers have put their reputations on the line, promising great things. Nothing has eventuated so far. But even if it is a win for the White House, for the Democrats, they really did not have the great success, the blue wave that the pollsters told us, and Democrats like Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, vowed would happen. In fact, quite the opposite. In the House, we were told that Republicans would lose 15 to 20 seats. That's what the polls were saying. In fact, it looks like they have flipped 12 Democrat seats, and there are 3 still to be decided. 3 Republican seats were also flipped to the Democrats. But all in all, it's been a big plus for the Republicans. They also managed to bring in 9 new women, Republican women, and the other 3 of the 12 a veteran and a black man, Burgess Owens, a former NFL star in Utah, and also a Hispanic former mayor of Miami-Dade County in Florida. So that gives you an indication of what Donald Trump did with the Republican Party. He took the sort of party of the business people and the elitists out of the hands of, you know, Mitt Romney and the Bushes and McCain, and he transformed it into something really unrecognizable, a much more, I think Republicans call it the sort of blue jeans and beer party. You saw that particularly, I did a bit of traveling in Western Pennsylvania and West Virginia and Ohio, where, you know, the home of fracking, where the oil and gas industry is huge and is the, you know, backbone of the economy, and jobs were very important. And Joe Biden really shot himself in the foot by saying that he was going to ban fracking. Whether or not he tried to weasel out of that later on, it wasn't believed on the ground. So in some ways, Donald Trump has managed to transform the party into a much more populist nationalist party, whereas you see by the huge outspending by big tech and Wall Street on Joe Biden's campaign, that the Democratic Party has become really a party of the very wealthy and the very poor, whereas the Republicans are there in the middle with the working and middle classes. And then that brings us to the Senate, which is the most important race really for control of the next 4 years. And there are 2 runoff races in Georgia where 2 Republican senators didn't manage to get over the 50% vote mark that's required by that state. So a runoff will be held on January 5. And enormous amounts of money and efforts and vote registration efforts are being put into Georgia right now. I mean, Democrats like Andrew Yang were urging, until he was castigated, urging Democrats from California to just move into Georgia briefly so that they could register under Georgia law and vote. And so whoever wins, if the Republicans win those 2 Senate seats, then they will have control of the Senate, which will mean that you know, Joe Biden will have a tough time, and in the midterms in 2022, with the House the way it is, the Republicans look as if they will have a good chance of winning the House and really turning the last 2 years of a Biden-Harris presidency into a lame duck presidency. And it will set them up very well for 2024, where I'll just conclude by referring to what Stephen Loosley talked about with the 1824 problems of Andrew Jackson, and say that 4 years later, he came back to win the presidency. And that is what Donald Trump's supporters, but not yet Donald Trump, are threatening that he will do, because in 2024, he will still be 4 years younger than Joe Biden.
Miranda, just really quick, 'cause I know you have to leave just a little early today. As a former senator from the state of Kansas, we were 10 Democrats in a body of 40. And in order to get our legislation through, we would have to team with the moderates in order to push legislation through. Do you foresee that happening in the federal Senate, where moderate Republicans will team with the Democrats to get legislation through the Senate?
Yeah, I could definitely see that happening. We saw, Mitt Romney do that. He was the only Republican to vote against the impeachment. But I'm sure that there is a taste after 4 years of real division and ugliness in politics on both sides, that there's really an appetite, I think, for unity, the sort of unity that Joe Biden is promising and is yet to deliver. But I could see that happening. I also could see, in another sense, some moderate Democrats combining with Republicans against the sort of progressive hard left wing of the Democratic Party, which I think was very problematic for them during the election, because they were the people responsible for defunding the police policies and very aggressive, hostile anti-energy, anti-fossil fuel policies, which really hurt Democrats in some suburban areas, and among moderate Democrats, among those people I talked about in Pennsylvania, that was very damaging. So I could see, for instance, Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker, needs 218 votes to be elected Speaker again, and there were 13 Democrats who voted against her last time. 10 of those Democrats are returning, and if they vote the way they did back then, she won't be Speaker again. And there is a younger black congressman from New York, Hakeem Jeffries, who's very well thought of, and he's waiting in the wings to take over her job, which I don't think would be a bad thing, because I think Speaker Pelosi was incredibly divisive. And, if you had to blame one single person in Congress for the division and ugliness of politics over the last 4 years, it would be her. And the perfect example is when she ripped up the President's State of the Union address in January, where a really ugly, sort of unprecedented moment.
Thank you very much, Miranda. I'll come back to you later. Ambassador Hockey, for us in Australia and around the world, we look at Trump as someone who is unpredictable and uncontrollable. Can you explain to our audience why he has so many followers? What is his attraction, and how was he able to grow his base?
Well, Donald Trump has represented the views of a part of America that felt that their views were never listened to, let alone acted upon. And that's why he got elected in 2016 as the anti-establishment candidate. Over a longer period of time, Washington has become not only more powerful as a centralized government, but it's become more of a morality policeman to the rest of the nation. And that is certainly not something Americans warm to. I think we've entered into an era where there is a lot of sanctimonious lecturing from politicians about the way people should behave. And as in my column with The Australian over a longer period of time, I created the fictional figure of Mary Milwaukee, a mum based in Wisconsin, worked all her life at Walmart, gets paid $11.11 an hour, has a son that's on his third tour of duty of Afghanistan, has a daughter that aspires to go to college, but her and her husband don't know if they've got the money for it. Her husband's one of 4 million truck drivers that never, of course, went to college. And her grandfather worked as a coal miner in West Virginia. And she looks at the world as it was and says, I have no future. What future do my children have? I'm making the sacrifices. I'm not getting ahead. And Donald Trump came along in 2016 and said, I hear you. Not only do I hear you, but I'm going to fight for you. And in fighting for you, I'm going to take on the establishment. I'm going to drain the swamp. I'm going to do things that people haven't done before. And I don't apologise for doing that. And she discounted all of his tweets, all of his bad behaviour and everything else, because he was the first person to come along and say, I am speaking for you and I am fighting for you. As a direct result, Donald Trump as president had a re-election strategy that was pretty clear. He was going to the election prior to coronavirus saying, I promised you tax cuts, I delivered you tax cuts. I promised you more spending on the military, I delivered more spending on the military. I promised you a great wall to keep out illegal immigrants, I built the wall. I promised you I'd pull out of Paris. I promised you I'd pull out of the TPP. I promised you I'd move the embassy to Jerusalem. I promised you that I'd bring your son home from Afghanistan. I promised you that I would get rid of regulation. I promised you that I would challenge the orthodoxy of the swamp. When did you last have a president that ever delivered what they promised? And I did. And you might not like it the way I say it or the way I do it, but that's the only way I can do it to fight for you. And Mary Milwaukee and her family bought into that until the coronavirus. And I think Donald Trump failed to properly manage the coronavirus. There's no doubt about that. And as a result of his failures in both communication and in various parts of the management of the coronavirus, Mary Milwaukee decided about 2 or 3 weeks out, like so many swing voters, that they were not going to go for Donald Trump this election because, unfortunately, they felt that he was more focused on his own health and his own interests than he was in theirs. And so Donald Trump spent the last 2 weeks of the campaign working hard to expand his vote, and he did. And all those naysayers around that said, oh, Donald Trump's only focusing on his base, actually, he went well beyond his base. Probably about between 7 and 10 million beyond the traditional Republican base. And he got more votes than any previous candidate for president, except Joe Biden fairly got more presidents than he did. And Joe Biden is the president elect. And look, the fundamental issue is this isn't going to change until the massive differences within the US community are addressed, and until there is a president that actually continues to listen to the Mary Milwaukees of the world.
Thank you, Ambassador. I just have a follow-up question in terms of the promises and policies that the president has implemented. Trade policy under President Trump has been characterized by an unusually aggressive approach to imposing tariffs on imports, including imports from friendly countries. Australia has largely been spared from those tariffs, at least in a direct sense. Even if a Biden administration would be less inclined to impose new tariffs, should Australia expect more restricted access to decision makers on these types of trade issues under a President Biden? And who do you, if you look at the forecast, who do you think that the president-elect may appoint as our new United States trade representative under President Biden?
Well, on that last bit, Donald, I'm not going to speculate on any of that. That's a mystery for a number of reasons. One of which is, as Miranda said, so much, and Stephen, so much depends on the outcome of the Senate. If the Democrats win, the two special elections in Georgia, then it will have a material impact on who Joe Biden nominates for the Senate, for various positions in the administration, because they will need to be confirmed by the Senate. So if he's got the numbers in the Senate, he can address more of the concerns of the left or the progressives. But obviously, if the Republicans hold the Senate, then it's going to be harder to get some of the more extreme people view on particular areas of trade. Having said that, I would view USTR Lighthizer, Bob Lighthizer, as an extremist when it came to trade. He and I clashed regularly, and that was because he was a big protectionist and he wanted to blow up the World Trade Organization. That is not in Australia's interest. That was not in Australia's interest. We believe in free and fair trade, so we're on the same page as the US in that sense. But we certainly oppose tariffs because tariffs are a tax on your own people. And in discussions with various people, including the president, they just didn't want to buy that. But that's what a tariff is. You're only taxing your own people, as are quotas. So, and Australia had a privileged position because, primarily because what we did was we focused on being a trusted supplier. And the US is going to continue to nationalise its supply chain under Joe Biden. Australia, and I worked with John McCain on this, to get Australia exempted from the requirement of buy only America for US Defence Forces. And so only the US, and he helped Canada as well, only the UK, Australia and Canada are approved suppliers to the US military outside of the US, obviously. So I think that nationalising of the supply chain, that it will extend to allies across every area of US commerce and trade, from capital markets, and we're seeing it even just today in relation to listed Chinese vehicles, through to supply chains in health, education, manufactured goods, and so on. Australia is in a great position and will continue to be in a great position, but I don't think operationally, other than the US under Biden engaging more in multilateral forums like the WTO and the WHO and Paris, I don't see any material change in trade policy. And bearing in mind, the Democrats have always been traditionally the protectionists. Democrat presidents have always signed free trade agreements, but they relied on Republicans to carry the day. And of course, that's materially changed.
Thank you, Ambassador. And I'd just like to go to Senator Loosley. Senator, as you know, I work for Norton Rose Fulbright as a lawyer, and we have 11 law firms in the United States. So our client base, it's important that the United States comes together. Australia in times of crisis has come together on both sides of politics, labor and liberal, and will work across the aisle through arguably bushfires, but the GFC and now COVID-19. What can the US learn from Australia, and how can compromise be met for the betterment of the people?
It's a fascinating question in the United States at the moment, Donald. I note that Senator Mitch McConnell, the Republican Majority Leader, has let it be known in an interview that he'd like to be bracketed in terms of American congressional history with LBJ, with Senator Lyndon Baines Johnson, who was, of course, Majority Leader during the Eisenhower period. Now, in order to be as successful as LBJ as a parliamentarian and legislator, you have to have a relationship similar to that which LBJ had with President Eisenhower's White House. If Senator McConnell wants to achieve that, then there will be a reaching across the aisle. I actually think tight numbers in the House and in the Senate can work in the President-elect's favour, because he is the one who has talked bipartisanship, lowering the temperature, getting things done. And regardless of whether or not Senators Perdue and Loeffler are returned on 5 January in Georgia, or their Democratic opponents win, I think you see the Senate can act as a restraint. It may be, as Miranda suggested, it simply becomes obstructionist, but you pay a price for that. So there's restraint upon the left of the Democratic Party, given the tightness of numbers in the House and the Senate, and it means that the Biden administration, to get things done, tacks towards the centre. I'll make this point, Donald, about the election. American voters have been very committed and very deliberate. That's shown by the turnout, and it's shown by the results, where in the Senate and the House, there have been tickets that have gone one way, and the presidency the other way, to the extent of about 5 million votes for President-elect Biden that weren't necessarily replicated in House and in Senate races. So people made very deliberate decisions. You look at candidates of real quality. I'm thinking of Susan Collins in Maine, John Hickenlooper in Colorado, Mark Kelly out in Arizona. They won because people had a very careful look at them, regardless of their party affiliations, and the blue pencil tick. Similarly, with Joe Biden, the polls that I've seen consistently during 2020, over 60% of Americans said essentially they liked the then former vice president. That's not something which was a factor in 2016. So I think that's one of the elements that saw the Biden-Harris ticket successful. So if we're looking at the Australian experience, I think Prime Minister Morrison's done a very good job with COVID. I think he learned from the bushfire experience, and he learned the lessons very quickly, the same as in New South Wales, Premier Berejiklian learned from the fiasco of the Ruby Princess and applied the lessons. So the National Cabinet has been a step forward. It's bipartisan, it's federal and state, and it shows that things can get done. So I like the President-elect's response to a question. Let's not only lead by the example of our power, but by the power of our example. So I think in terms of Australia's relations with the US, yes, we've been able to do things, and as close friends and allies, we can pass those lessons on and we can make that contribution.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you, Senator Loosley. Ms. Devine, I wanted to come back to you because I had a look at your Twitter account yesterday, and I'm even following you. You have a lot of followers, and you're very vocal when it comes to media in election campaigns. A lot has been said about networks, print and on television, having a strong opinion on the policies and election topics. Is free press dead? Is the end of democracy and the representation of all views as a bipartisan commentator just gone away? And will Trump TV uproot the conservative media? How does the public receive fair and accurate news?
Thanks, Donald. Well, look, we have more than 73 million people voted for Donald Trump, and they're pretty angry at the moment. You know, a majority of them, according to a poll I saw today, don't believe that the election was fair, and they don't trust the media. And partly that is the media's own fault. For the last 4 years, since Donald Trump came in, I think there were a lot of journalists that blamed themselves. I know Google, for instance, had an enormous meeting after the 2016 election and beat themselves up and promised to do better. Same with Mark Zuckerberg from Facebook. You know, the big tech giants certainly were influential in this election, and there's a lot of feeling that they, as well as mainstream media, were biased towards the Democrats. Now, mainstream media, you know, the establishment media, the elite of the establishment media, the New York Times and the Washington Post and the networks, TV networks, they spent really 3 years, the first 3 years of the Trump administration, pursuing this Russia collusion story, which turned out not to be true. And that was something that, you know, was cooked up by Hillary Clinton's campaign as a dirty trick, that Donald Trump was a Russian spy, and that ended up becoming weaponized and turned into a cudgel to really hobble the Trump administration for the first 3 years. And then there was a special prosecutor looked into it, Robert Mueller. I think it cost several $1 million, and finally found that there was no Russia collusion. And then, of course, there was the impeachment of Donald Trump, and then came COVID. So it's, and COVID, every single death, the 200,000 plus deaths in America were hung around Donald Trump's neck, you know, fairly or unfairly. So those 73 million certainly feel that the mainstream media and the big tech giants let them down, tricked them, and rigged the situation so that Donald Trump lost, because it was a very strange election campaign. I mean, Joe Biden was almost invisible. He stayed in his basement, as the saying goes. Pretty much that was true. because of COVID, he hardly emerged, and Donald Trump was just an ever-present force who, talked too much and did himself a lot of damage. And in effect, I think the Democrats decided to go with we're not Trump message, and it worked for them clearly. But also on COVID, that allowed Joe Biden to hide away and use his silence as a way of showing how responsible he was about social distancing and so on. And then you also saw in the few times he did come out, particularly towards the end of the campaign, he would get these incredible softball questions when he wasn't, he hardly was available, and then he would allow maybe 4 or 5 questions every now and then at the end of an appearance, a speech. And the questions were very, very mild, and most of them were angled at, saying, how bad is Donald Trump? And there were also some town halls with George Stephanopoulos and other friendly people. The debates, I don't know how influential they were. There were only 2 in the end, but the first one, Donald Trump was very aggressive, and that really played badly for him and well for Joe Biden. So the media did not put Joe Biden under as much scrutiny as they did Donald Trump. And that was, glaringly obvious, and it still goes on to this day. And I think there's a lot of resentment about that, and a feeling that bad news about Joe Biden was suppressed. I'd worked for the New York Post. We had a story beginning of October about Joe Biden's son, Hunter Biden's laptop computer, which contained a lot of emails we published and other information, which seemed to suggest that Joe Biden was involved in his family's influence peddling scheme overseas. Now, that in the end, Facebook and Twitter censored that story, locked our account, Twitter, for 2 weeks. Most of the rest of the media didn't really report on it. So some pretty serious allegations went unanswered. So really you have a president or a president-elect, but a soon-to-be president who, while he was vice president under Barack Obama, not much is known about, and not much scrutiny was given to these sort of sinister background stories. And so again, those stories got out through these right-wing blogs and these other sort of fragmented ways that people get information now, and particularly to conservatives who don't trust the mainstream media. So the sort of information they're getting, it can be a lot of conspiracy theories, a lot of exaggeration and misinformation, but because they don't trust CNN or the New York Times, that's what they're going to. And that really leads to a country where two sides are imbibing very different views of what reality is, and never the twain shall meet. And I don't see how the media can really resolve that unless they win back the trust that they lost of those 73 million people. And I think that'll be very difficult.
And just to follow up, there are 2 men on the earth that I believe that will not back down, and that is Donald Trump and Rupert Murdoch. And as you can remember, Fox News called Arizona for Joe Biden, and it infuriated the president. If a Trump TV is to uproot, then what does that mean between the 2, Rupert Murdoch and Donald Trump, and the next battle for the conservative media trophy?
Well, Fox News was right. Arizona, they called Arizona early, but it turned out that Joe Biden did win Arizona. So, I know that Donald Trump has been increasingly angry and vocal about how he describes Fox News as having disappointed him. He said the big difference between 2016 and 2020 was that Fox News wasn't backing him. My view on that is that Fox News is much more balanced than the other cable networks. We now have a mixture of, sort of small L liberal commentators during the day, and we've invited on like former Democratic operative Donna Brazile, who worked for Hillary Clinton, and various people like that, to try and give some balance. And at night we have the Hannity, Sean Hannity, who's a friend of Donald Trump's, Tucker Carlson, who's his own man, and so there's a mixture of conservative and smaller liberal voices on the network. And while those 73 million, many of them are very angry with Fox News for what they see as bias, because they want a network that is the exact opposite of, say, CNN, which has just become 100% Democrat all the way. And so these other little networks have sprung up, like Newsmax and OAN, and they're boasting that their ratings after the election are enormous and that they're going to beat Fox News. But Fox News still is the most watched, not just cable. Tucker Carlson is the most watched television personality in the country. So I don't really think that Fox News has anything to worry about. Trump TV, Trump Network, he certainly is a formidable presence, and he would give us a run for our money, that's for sure. And he, I'm sure if he decides not to go back into politics, that is what he'll do. And you can sort of read between the lines with the way he's trashing Fox News any chance he gets, that he's aiming for his next career move. And maybe he'll have a built-in audience of 73 million people. Who knows? And I think, though, that, the Murdoch family is ready for competition, always have been.
Most certainly. Miranda, thank you so much. I know you have to leave us. I wish you could stay a little bit longer, but thank you so much for coming on today. We're grateful for your comments.
Great to talk to all of you. Bye-bye.
I think we'll go to the audience questions, because they're kind of piling up. And I think the first one, Ambassador, are you ready for a China question? Because Trevor Rowe questions, under a Biden administration, will the tone, not necessarily the substance, change to ensure constructive, nevertheless robust? And if so, will the change assist Australia in its reaction to the challenges China is presenting to the Australian trade with China? Do the panelists agree that China is punishing Australia, given our important relationship with the United States, and to demonstrate to other Asian nations with the price of being seen to defy China's activities? Can you make some sense of that question?
Yeah. So, Trevor, there will be a tempering of the language between, the US president and China. I don't see Joe Biden referring to the coronavirus as the China virus, for example. However, I think China is friendless in Washington, D.C. For a range of reasons, including its aggressive behaviour and aggressive words in response to events that unfold. So, be it FONOPS operations in the South China Sea, or even the skirmishes on the border with India, China, has been very aggressive. And as such, the American administration and Congress is pushing back very hard, and they will continue to do so. I don't see Joe Biden taking a softer approach to China at all. In fact, he's got every political incentive not to, given that some political accusations were made against him in the last election that he had some commercial dealings with China. Now, they may well have been unfounded, totally unfounded. I'd imagine they were, but that combined with the suggestion that blue-collar workers turn to Donald Trump means that the US will not take a softer approach unless there is some way of breaking the tension. The second thing is the Democrats will prosecute human rights issues in China in a way that Donald Trump had no interest. And that will, of course, be inflammatory for China as well. From an Australian perspective, it does give us a window of opportunity to rebuild the relationship. But again, you know, there's just these constant threats, and you know, yes, there is a lot of tension, but do I see a pathway at the moment to break that down, to pull back? No, I don't. I don't know what that pathway is. So that'll take better diplomacy than anything I could offer.
Thank you, Ambassador. Senator Loosley, Cameron Mills has a question, and she says, we hear a lot about the selection of a president, and she wonders what presidential candidate would be best for Australia.
In terms of a comparison between Donald Trump and Joe Biden?
Yes, I assume that's where she wants to go with that.
From the perspective of a close and enduring alliance relationship with the United States, I think Joe Biden is better. That's not to say that the relationship with the Americans has not been sound, has not been effective, and I acknowledge the contribution of Ambassador Hockey in that, along with his predecessor Kim Beazley and his successor Arthur Sinodinos. We've played a very straight bat. There's a classic example of President Trump announcing unilateral withdrawal from the Middle East that really took us by surprise, and Joe would be more familiar with this than I happen to be, but I was in Washington shortly thereafter, and embassy people were quietly saying that they went into the State Department, they went into the Pentagon to have a discussion about what the consequences would be, given we have military personnel and assets in the region. And they began by saying, well, the president's statement really took us by surprise. And the reply came back, well, it took us by surprise too. So it's a question where you try and work these issues through, and I think Australia's been effective in that light, and don't minimise the relationship between Prime Minister Morrison and President Trump. We've not banged drums, we've not jumped up and down, we've just gotten on with the job. Now, where President-elect Biden is likely to be a better president for Australia, very good relationship with Australians and Australia during the Obama administration. He was on very good terms, for example, with Foreign Minister Julie Bishop. And I remember attending a private forum in the Treaty Room in the White House with Vice President Biden at the time, where he was excellent on the range of issues in our part of the world, now best characterised as the Indo-Pacific. So I think the tendency in a Biden administration will be less unilateralism and greater multilateralism, and Joe may have made that point a little earlier today, to work with allies. And that brings us to opportunities over time in terms of trade agreements. If there's any revision in the TPP in the years ahead, it will be seen in Washington as much as a strategic document as an economic and investment document. The great danger, and John Bolton pointed this out in his book when he left the administration, that Taiwan may have been thrown under the bus by President Trump in the pursuit of an overall trade deal. I don't think we'll see that under a Biden administration. And I underline that the remark that Joe made, there is a convergence of view in Washington, DC about China, and it's negative. From the treatment of the Uyghurs, which brings in the left of politics in the Congress, particularly Democrats, through theft of IP, through hacking of American sites, and the like, right through to militarism in the South China Sea. All of those issues work to the disadvantage of China, and all of those are really diplomatic debacles for China, which will continue to feature under a Biden administration.
Thank you, Senator. I have a question, but and both of you can probably chime in on this one, from Daniel Allman from Norton Rose Fulbright in our Sydney office. what are the prospects of the United States under President Biden rejoining the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement? And relatedly, how will this week's signing of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which may consider to have been spearheaded by China, how will it be viewed by Biden and the White House? Is the signing of the RCEP likely to have any bearing on the new administration's decision about whether to rejoin the TPP? Ambassador, you want to take it first?
Well, in my view, America's just not going to join. The United States is just not going to join the TPP. I think, you know, again, what the Democrats have learned is that Donald Trump, you know, turned 120 degrees and went straight for their base, and was out early opposing the TPP, and Hillary Clinton followed him up. And you know, there's an interesting backstory about how we were close to getting the TPP through immediately after the election and before what was meant to be the inauguration of Hillary Clinton. And I was dealing directly with Dennis McDonough, the chief staff to President Obama, about that. But you'll read about that in my book when it comes out. So I don't think you'll see I don't think you'll see the US sign up to TPP. In relation to RCEP, that's been going for years, man. I mean, it's been going forever. And the US knew we were negotiating, and we wanted to negotiate, and it just perfectly illustrates where Australia is at. We believe in free trade. You know, and I in particular used to be accused of being, you know, some sort of apologist for Donald Trump, that, you know, that somehow we were just a rubber stamp for Donald Trump. Nothing could illustrate it further than the fact that we pushed ahead and signed the Trans-Pacific Partnership when the US pulled out, and then have gone ahead and signed RCEP when you know, the US was never invited to join RCEP, but signed RCEP. And we are strong advocates for the WTO, and we had huge arguments with USTR Lighthizer about you know, appointments to the appeals panel of the WTO, and America, without actually pulling out of the WTO, basically wanted to blow it up. So let's be frank, hopefully there'll be greater engagement in multilateral forums, and there'll be you know, discussions, but politically, I don't see how Joe Biden can go into the TPP, and I don't see the US or China or Japan, by the way, joining RCEP.
Senator, did you have some comments for that one, on that?
In the short term, it's very difficult to see the TPP back successfully on an American agenda. But Donald, I'm an optimist. I'm coming up for nearly a half century of membership of the Australian Labor Party. I've had to be an optimist much of my political life. So there is nothing wrong with Australia continuing quietly to press on trade liberalisation, with the objective of developing a convergence of view over time. This will take years, but it's something worth pursuing. From an Australian perspective, in terms of arrangements, the new and emerging arrangement with Japan is probably of more immediate consequence, as is the Quad with the US, Japan, and India.
And
I want to correct something, Donald. I said before Japan's not in RCEP. They are. I was thinking of the Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank.
Thank you. Duly noted.
We are part of, and Japan and the United States are not as well.
Ambassador, just give us a plug for your book real quick. I know we don't have much time, but when is it coming out? Tell us about it.
Well, it's no.
Why not?
It's coming.
It's coming. Okay. Stay tuned. And the final question, America's made history with the first woman as vice president and first biracial woman. Should President-elect Biden step down, what does a Kamala Harris presidency mean for Australia and the United States?
Look, I think that's hypothetical. Look, let me just say this. I mean, you know it, Donald, better than any of us here, that there is a deep and long history of racial divide in the United States. Somehow the nation has become, it's not the most multinational country in the world, but it's very close. I think Australia is probably number one, Canada number two, and then the US there. But my time living in the United States, it's one of the things that I have been most surprised about is the deep historical divisions in the community. And it's hugely complicated. And from an outside perspective, I don't really expect Australians to understand. We have our own history and, a tortured history of treatment of Indigenous Australians. And despite the very best intentions, we got so far to go. And I think in the United States, the heal is something that, is going to take a long time to come. But there's no doubt in my mind that the election of Joe Biden is a step forward. I mean, he is a hugger, and may he continue to be a hugger, despite everyone in this, socially correct world saying don't touch and don't hug and forget it. We actually need someone who is a hugger. Can we please get over the social distancing crap and focus on how we can, and when I say that, I don't mean it from a COVID perspective. Of course, you've got to keep social distance. But the idea that, you don't embrace, a sister or a brother, I think is ridiculous. And I think it's really important that, Joe Biden can be a healer. And Kamala Harris is part of that. But so will be Hispanics that he appoints into key cabinet positions, and all the different shapes and colours and diversities of America. I think it's a step forward. There is a step forward there, and age differences and so on. I mean, the most significant barrier he has smashed is someone so old getting elected. I mean, I feel guilty that I asked John Howard to resign as Prime Minister because I thought he was going to be too old competing at 75 against at the election after that, and how absurd it looks like. How absurd that history looks today, given the age of the participants. But, so there are many things that need to be addressed. The racial divide in America is tragic, but you've got to understand, and it, Donald, and I'm sure Stephen's aware of it, and everyone, you've got to understand how horrific and horrible the whole process of slavery was, and the divides that followed it, which were both Democrat and Republican. I mean, it was over time. I mean, seriously, it's got it's still got some way to go, but that's not for us to comment.
Well, with that, Senator, I know April wants to finish on time, and if we had another hour, I think the audience would really will benefit from this commentary. So I'll pass it over to April. Thank you, gentlemen, for a wonderful conversation. Bless you.
Yeah, thank you to Donald, and thank you to both the speakers who are still on the line and to our speaker who had to leave a little bit early. This has been an incredibly robust discussion. I think it's been one of the most diverse discussions that we've had, having an American living in Australia, having an Australian living in America, having a historian who knows all the way back to the 1800s of US politics, having Ambassador Hockey sitting there in purgatory, in quarantine, halfway between the United States and Australia, and such a diverse range of views. It's been really, really fascinating. You can see we still have a lot of questions in the question box, a bunch more in the chat box that we haven't been able to get to, but Stephen Loosley is one of our governors. Joe Hockey is one of our members. So you will get to see them again and engage with them again through AmCham. We really thank you all for being here today with us and encourage you to stay involved in the democratic process. Thank you to our speakers. Thank you to our moderator, and have a great day, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you, April. Thank you, Donald.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.